Okay, so last week we did not finish again. Second week in a row, but I think we got it this time because there's some overlap in the text that it covers from the end of last week to the beginning of this week. And then there's some stuff that is suitable to just read from the book because it'll be a good overview. So yeah, we should actually finish up. But for everyone, whether you were here or not, recap of last week, we had the death of Absalom. That was David's son who usurped his throne. Whole battle happened there. Absalom died. We had the rebellion of Sheba. This was a man who, in that political turmoil resulting from that rebellion, he was able to consolidate the 10 northern tribes of Israel against David. There was another situation there, a rebellion, that got put down. David was reinstated as king, and then we dealt with his sin of numbering the people, where it seems to be a pride issue, where after trusting God for all this time to save him from battles, from enemies, from this and that, David decides to kind of survey the military might that he has been able to get together, and there are consequences for that. We looked at that in depth. But before we get ahead of ourselves, that's what happened last week. Why don't we open up in prayer and then we'll jump in. Lord, I thank you for this day. I thank you for this group that was able to get together. I just pray that you'd be with us during this time. Help us learn what you would have, that we could take it forward with us and understand you better and be able to walk better and just closer to you. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. And if anyone can't hear me at any time, let me know. We got the windows open. We got more road noise, so don't be shy on that. So in your book, we're going to be on page 95. It's the tail end of last week's lesson. And our text, when we get to it, will have us in 1 Kings chapter 1. Okay, so we're going to start in your book on page 95. We already said David regained his throne. We had some stuff there. In your book starts at 70. David was nearing death. His oldest living son, Adonijah, announced his intention to be the next king. He called together his brothers and others to a victory celebration in South Jerusalem, but he excluded Nathan and Solomon. Meanwhile, Nathan and Bathsheba carefully choreographed a plan whereby they would inform David of Adonijah's self-exaltation and remind David of his previous selection of Solomon. So that's pretty straightforward, but David's oldest living son now says, well, I'm obviously going to be king, even though David is not dead yet, and he starts setting himself up as king. And we'll go into 1 Kings. We're going to take a short look at this plan that Nathan, David's prophet, and Bathsheba, one of his wives, has planned to get Solomon installed as king. So 1 Kings 1, verse 32. And King David said, "Call me Zadok the priest, and Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada." And they came before the king. The king also said unto them, "Take with you the servants of your Lord, and cause Solomon my son to ride upon my own mule, and bring him down to Gihon. And let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him there over Israel, and blow ye with the trumpet, and say, God save King Solomon. Then ye shall come up after him, that he may come and sit upon my throne, for he shall be king in my stead. And I have appointed him to be ruler over Israel and over Judah." Okay, before we move on too far, I want to make sure we understand exactly what's going on. So Adonijah is the oldest living son of David. Why should he not be king? Do we have any reason for this? Yeah, so so The book of First Chronicles digs into more detail because Chronicles is from a priestly perspective, so there's even more insight into like God's views on certain matters. But we know from the start, again from Chronicles, the temple is going to be built by David's son, a king, a man of peace, and then along comes Solomon, who we said last week, his name means man of peace, literally. And you get all these ideas throughout that at his birth it says God loved Solomon, so it shows that God chose him for something very specific. So even though the oldest son is doing what it's hard to say what they all understood or decided they understood. The oldest son, what he did, he clearly knew he was doing something a little off because he didn't invite a very select couple people to this inaugural event, but he had the whole a military group with him. This son Adonijah rode in on a horse into one of the cities, kind of fanfare proclaiming himself, okay, here's the son of David, the new king. And then David crafts this plan where he says, okay, I'm going to get my official prophet, the priest Zadok, and Benaiah, who was a military leader of his. And they have Solomon ride into Jerusalem on a mule, a mule. It's David's animal. It's like riding in on David's hot rod. Like that's the idea there, because horses are a military vehicle back in that day. A mule or donkey is what a king would normally come in on. The horse was more militaristic. You're conquering a place when you come in on a horse. So he has Solomon ride on the mule from a spot to Jerusalem, and he comes in and is announced king. Now, this will come up again in our last lesson that we do when I said we're going to connect what happens here to events in the life of Jesus. We're actually going to show how these things are a shadow of Shiloh, as the book is titled. And if you are familiar with the Palm Sunday story of Jesus riding in on the donkey from the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem, this is all intricately tied in. Like, why does Jesus do this? Well, this is what Solomon did. That's why there's a prophecy about it. That's why it makes sense in its context once you understand who did it first and what Jesus is kind of putting out there by following this line, that he is the true king. This is what Solomon is doing, but we'll dig into all of that in 2 weeks when we have more time. So that is successful. Adonijah is very afraid when he realizes, Solomon's actually on the throne. David officially announced publicly that Solomon is king. So Adonijah, who just kind of proclaimed himself king, is, I got a problem here. He runs into the temple, kind of like the old school, the sanctuary type thing, when someone would run into a church and sanctuary, like they couldn't be killed. He was going for that kind of thing. And Solomon spares him, but we'll keep going on. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How old was he when he was going to war with Saul and all that? How many years before he passed out?
Yeah, so give or take a couple years. Well, no. So from where I'm going to go. So give or take a couple. So where he's at 70 here, I don't know exactly how much longer he lives, but so maybe a couple years past this he'll live. And it says that he reigned in total for 40 years as king. So if not earlier, so let's just say 70. If he dies at 70, he took the throne initially way back at 30 years old. So he would have been, however long he's employed by Saul, because he kills Goliath, he gets into the court, and then he's going to, one of Saul's generals. So he's on the run for 2 to 3 years. So it's kind of blurry, but probably in his 20s, all that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in 1 Kings chapter 2, this is why I say I don't think he lives long past 70. We have 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 1. Now the days of King David drew nigh that he should die, and he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth. Be thou strong, therefore, and show thyself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments, and his judgments and his testimonies, as it's written in the law of Moses, that thou mayest prosper in all that thou doest, whithersoever thou turnest thyself. And that the Lord may continue his word, which he spoke concerning me, saying, If thy children take heed to their ways, to walk before me in truth with all their heart, with all their soul, there shall not fail thee, said he, a man on the throne of Israel. Moreover, thou knowest also what Joab, the son of Zeruiah, did to me, what he did to the two captains of the host of Israel, to Abner, the son of Ner, to Amasa, the son of Jether, whom he slew, and shed blood of war in peace. But the blood of war upon his girdle that was about his loins, and in his shoes that were on his feet, do therefore according to thy wisdom, and let not his hoary head, that refers to his gray head, go down to the grave in peace. But show kindness unto the sons of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and let him be of those who eat at thy table. For so they came to me, and I fled because of Absalom, when I fled because of Absalom thy brother. Behold, thou hast with thee Shimiai, the son of Gera, the Benjamite of Burim, which cursed me with a grievous curse in the day I went to Mahanaim. But he came down to meet me at Jordan, and I swear to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put thee to death with the sword. Now therefore hold him not guiltless, for thou art a wise man, and knowest what thou ought to do unto him. But his hoary head bring down to the grave with blood. So David slept with his fathers, and was buried in the city of David. And the days that David reigned over Israel were 40 years. 7 years reigned he in Hebron, and 33 years reigned he in Jerusalem. Then Solomon sat upon the throne of David his father, and the kingdom was established greatly. Interesting last words, huh? So these are the last things that he's saying to his son. And the main gist is, he starts off with, be a man, okay? He reminds him of the covenant that God made between God and the line of David to follow his ways. And then he kind of gives him a hit list, okay? Avenge some wrongs, which is interesting. So there's a few people who he does not want to allow to just die naturally of old age. And those are, I assume he didn't just, breathe his last right then, but these are the last recorded things that David says to Solomon. So it's an interesting makeup, I don't think many of us get such interesting last words, at least. Yeah. So that's where last week's lesson ended. That's what we didn't get to. We see David's death, and it is worth seeing probably at the very bottom of page 96 in your book, when it says, David passed away and was buried in the city of David in the 40th year of his reign. Despite his many problems and sins, he died in a good old age, full of days, riches, and honor. And that's from 1 Chronicles, which recounts the same thing. But again, it gives that perspective of even all the problems that we looked at throughout his reign, he's still greatly respected. And as time goes by, he is the gold standard of king, that if we were to keep reading into Kings, like into 1st and 2nd Kings, it's always this king followed the ways of his father David, or this king did evil, not like his father David. So despite his flaws, because he's a man after God's own heart, because he was the man God chose, he is the gold standard of kings in Israel's ethos. But let's jump into this week's lesson, and this should be good. For some reason, this lesson starts off trying to rehash exactly what we just talked about with Solomon taking the throne, so we can jump ahead a little bit. So we'll actually be on page 100 in your book. Okay. So we understand everything that happened with Solomon, with Adonijah, who tried to take the throne. That didn't work out, but he's still alive. So probably further down page 100, a paragraph starts with, Adonijah, ever the schemer, made a private visit to Bathsheba to restate his conviction that because of popular support, he should have become the king. But he also acknowledged God's gift of the throne to his younger brother. He appealed to Bathsheba to petition Solomon to grant him the beautiful Abishag to be his wife. Abishag was David's concubine. She helped him in his old age. So we didn't read it, but let me explain Abishag. So as David was getting old, as he's in his 70s, he has a pretty normal, like, old people problem where he's cold. He can't contain heat. They see this as a sign of, okay, he's kind of on his last legs. And the solution is, okay, we need someone to, like, lay next to him, like, kind of like staving off hypothermia. Like, okay, we need someone, like, in bed to just be there. And because you're the king of an ancient Near Eastern country, well, you don't just have anyone. We go, okay, we got to find a really beautiful young woman, and, because that's just who you have. So the text is explicit that, like, nothing happened, and you got to think, okay, he's so old and frail that he's not even maintaining body heat. There's nothing off standard going on here. And even if he wanted to, he could have just had her as a normal concubine. There's very little held back from these kings, but that's explicitly stated. So Adonijah asks Bathsheba, who is Solomon's mother, you know what, I want to marry her. Can I do that? Can you ask Solomon? He won't say no to you. How do you think Solomon responds, and why? What's that?
He rejects the offer or the request
Okay, why?
because she was the king's concubine. That's the same reason why things happened with the other brother,
Mm-hmm.
where he stuck with the concubine because it's like a power thing.
Okay, yep. Yeah, and it's kind of like, almost like, because the concubine is not a wife in the traditional sense, but it's sort of like getting into the kingly line. I mean, he's already a son of the king. But yeah, it's this idea that you're kind of like, it's like a move to legitimize your claim to the throne. Like, oh, well, yeah, Solomon's the younger brother, so there's this older brother, and he's married to one of the old king's concubines. Like, it sort of strengthens his claim to the throne. So, as expected, Solomon is not thrilled with this. Chapter 2, verse 19. Bathsheba therefore went unto King Solomon to speak unto him for Adonijah. The king rose up to meet her and bowed himself unto her and sat down on his throne and caused a seat to be set for the king's mother, and she sat on his right hand. Then she said, I desire one small petition of thee. I pray thee, say me not nay, don't say no. And the king said unto her, Ask on, my mother, for I will not say no. And she said, Let Abishag the Shunammite be given to Adonijah thy brother to wife. King Solomon answered and said unto his mother, Why dost thou ask Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask him for the kingdom also? For he's my elder brother, even for him, and for Abiathar the high priest, and for Joab the son of Zeruiah. Then King Solomon sware by the Lord, saying, God do so to me, and more also, if Adonijah have not spoken this word against his own life. Now therefore, as the Lord liveth, which hath established me and set me on the throne of David my father, and who has made me a house, as he promised, Adonijah shall be put to death this day. And King Solomon sent by the hand of Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, and he fell on him that he died. So Solomon took that exactly as we expected. I'm not entirely sure if Bathsheba, the book kind of suggests that maybe she knew, like maybe she was in on it and knew Solomon wouldn't say this. I think that's assuming a lot. She just seems to unwittingly say, like, I don't know if she feels bad for Adonijah. Like, he was king for like 5 minutes. He's really bummed out. Just do this, you know. Solomon sees it as the threat to the throne that it's intended to be, and he dispatches with that very quickly. And this man, Benaiah, who has been a military leader in the past, plays a big role in Solomon's regime. So, let's look at, in your book on page 101, Abiathar, the high priest. Do we remember who Abiathar is? There's so many names, and they seem to all start with A. We had Absalom, Adonijah, Abiathar. Yeah. Do we know Abiathar? So you remember when David was on the run, he went to the tabernacle, and a priest helped him. He gave him the bread, the sword of Goliath, and as a result, Saul ended up slaughtering all of them except for one guy. He ran to David. That was Abiathar. So he ends up being high priest for a while because he's the last one left in that line. So he supports David, but we see Abiathar the high priest had supported David during Absalom's rebellion. However, when Adonijah attempted to seize the throne from Solomon, Abiathar joined him. Even after Solomon became king, Abiathar still favored Adonijah. For his lack of loyalty, Solomon removed him from the priesthood and banished him to his home. Zadok became Israel's new high priest. And if you look in chapter 2, verse 27, it says, "So Solomon thrust out Abiathar from being priest unto the Lord, that he might fulfill the words of the Lord, which he spake concerning the house of Eli in Shiloh." So this has taken us way back to week 2 or 3, when we had Eli and his bad sons, who were the priests, and their punishment was that eventually that whole line was no longer going to be high priest. It was going to be given to another faithful priest who would have a house that's just established and ongoing. So this is the moment where that happens. Abiathar, besides what he did in supporting this rebellion, that's the thing. It's those double meaning, those double occurrences that we've talked about, where, okay, so why was Abiathar no longer allowed to be priest? Well, because he supported a rebellious king, but also God had prophesied this and said, years before, that this house was going to be done away with. Eli's line, Abiathar was no longer going to be the priest, and like we said all those weeks ago, the line of Zadok ends up being priest from now till about 100 BC, and I won't get into that. There's interesting stuff around that too in the intertestamental period before Jesus comes on the scene. But yeah, so Zadok ends up being, that line is high priest for close to 1,000 years at this point. Okay, so you're kind of seeing some dominoes start to fall. We have Adonijah killed. The priest who supported Adonijah's attempt to take the throne, he's kind of like defrocked, I guess. And now, chapter 2, verse 28. Then tidings came to Joab, for Joab had turned after Adonijah, though he had not turned after Absalom. But Joab fled unto the tabernacle of the Lord and caught hold of the horns of the altar. This is what Adonijah had done the first time. And it was told King Solomon that Joab was fled into the tabernacle of the Lord, and behold, he's by the altar. Then Solomon sent Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, saying, "Go, fall upon him." And then jump to verse 34. So Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, went up and fell upon him and slew him, and he was buried in his own house in the wilderness. And the king put Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, in his room over the host, and Zadok the priest did the king put in the room of Abiathar. And so by room, they mean the position. So Joab, who under David had been, like the chief warlord, chief general, however you want to think of that. He commanded the troops. Now this Benaiah, who has been acting as Solomon's assassin, more or less. Legal execution. That's a much nicer way to put it. Yes. He is now in charge of the army, and they say, of course, Zadok is now in charge of the priestly line. And then we get, we don't need to read about it, but Shimiai, the guy who, when David was running from Absalom, you have to remember which time he was running, when he was running from the son who had usurped the throne back in the day, Shimei was the servant of Saul who threw rocks at him, was cursing at him, and David accepted it at the time and said, well, all this is a result of my sin, this fractured kingdom, this chaos that we're in. So like this is a reproach from God. Let him be, let him do what he will. Of course, if you caught it in his last words to Solomon, he said, well, I can't kill him, but he is not someone who can go down to the grave in peace. So Benaiah also kills Shimei. And I want to look at question 3 in your book and maybe alter it a little bit. Why were Solomon's slayings of Adonijah, Joab, and Shimei wise moves? And I would alter that to, were they? What do you think about these hits, these lawful executions, as Pastor puts it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he would be able to live, but he had restrictions. So he was under semi-house arrest.
Yeah, we didn't get into it, yeah.
But he's under like a sort of house arrest.
Yeah.
And he broke that.
Mm-hmm.
And led the city, ran over his schemes. So he was
Mm-hmm.
thinking back, but he broke the regulations.
Mm-hmm.
He was warned if he did, he was done.
Okay.
So he's done.
Yeah. Okay. What do we think about the others? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But when he was talking to Solomon at the end, he did seem to know, like he could guess that he would, I don't know how he found that, but like it's like he's saying, okay, he did all this,
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like.
Right. Yeah, because.
Yeah, so there's a distinction between in battle and you're killing somebody.
Yes.
And you're not in battle, it's peacetime.
Mm-hmm.
You went and you murdered somebody.
Right.
And he's making that distinction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you remember who Joab killed, they were both people, like captains, who David brought in from the other side in order to unify the people. So the one was one of Saul's old captains, and he brought them in to kind of, bring all the support together. And then the person he killed last week was from his son Absalom's rebellion. He brought in his captain to kind of, again, unify the people who were, with Absalom. And so, yeah, Joab was really going out of his way for personal pride, really chipping away at David's attempts at peace in the nation. Yeah, I think it's tricky because I find it ironic that the guy who's named Man of Peace starts his reign with, several assassinations, but then, they are... I call them assassinations because they have that vibe to me, and that means nothing. That doesn't mean anything. The king Pastor is more correct in his statement that the king sent out his executioner because they deserved death, and the king sent it out, it's lawful. But whenever you go and hunt someone down, to me, like that feels like an assassination, as opposed to like chopping block type, public arena execution. Pastor is more correct. That's how it always felt to me.
I think he had to do it to stay appear strong and not weak.
Yeah.
And like he said, when I was born to be left hand or left
Yeah.
If you let that go, you're going to look weak.
Yeah.
And other people may see that,
Mm-hmm.
maybe you had to maintain that I'm a man and
Mm-hmm.
process is what happens.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think ultimately it is wisdom that he follows through on these things, that some of it David told him to do, some of it just had to be done because of the circumstances that came up. But yeah, so this is how he consolidates the kingdom to himself. So in your book, probably towards the bottom of page 101, we see, after disposing of his domestic enemies, Solomon strengthened his foreign policy by entering an alliance with Egypt, his most powerful neighbor to the south. The unnamed pharaoh was one of the last rulers of the 21st dynasty. This treaty was cemented by Solomon's marriage to Pharaoh's daughter. 1 Kings 9:16 reveals that Pharaoh gave the Canaanite city of Gezer to his daughter as a wedding gift. This strategically located city provided valuable economic and political ties for both nations. Solomon's queen lived with him in the city of David until a separate palatial residence was constructed 20 years later. And question 4, they ask, politically, how wise was Solomon's marriage to Pharaoh's daughter? Yeah. Yeah, politically seems like a solid move. I mean, yeah, we're very used to this throughout history, the political marriages. And question 5 asks, spiritually, how wise was the marriage?
Probably not good. So she's not Jew by
Yes. Yeah, so you're getting into the problem in the Bible, even in Jewish times, was not so much just marrying a foreign person, because they're actually, like, Moses was married to a non-Israelite, or funny terms, because they're not Israel yet, but, like, yeah, so you have people who are married to foreigners. The problem always ends up being, well, do they come and worship your God? Are they assimilating to the laws of the Jewish people? Or are they going to start leading you places like we saw all throughout the book of Judges? So nothing bad yet. Solomon just has this really solid political marriage. He even inherits a town from Pharaoh, which is really good politically for trade and all this. But we'll keep moving on. Okay, page 102. We see the Hebrews considered Gibeon. This answers a question we had a few weeks ago. The Hebrews considered Gibeon, located about 5 miles north of Jerusalem, a major high place for worship. It was the former site of the tabernacle and the ark. The ark had been removed to a tent in Jerusalem, and only the tabernacle and the bronze altar remained in Gibeon. Solomon called together all the leaders of Israel, the heads of the families, for a sacred convocation at Gibeon, where he supervised the presentation of 1,000 burnt offerings to the Lord. So if you recall, when David brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, we kind of had a question of like, well, it says he put it in a tent, and we kind of assumed it was the tabernacle. Apparently that was a little off. He brought the Ark and maybe some other things, but you still have the altar, the tent tabernacle structure itself, and the altar where you do the sacrifices still down at Gibeon. Solomon goes there and oversees 1,000 burnt offerings. So it's kind of like, all right, so you're the new king. God has just established your kingdom by all this. And, like, how many sacrifices do we make? Like, I don't know, like 1, and that's like a normal sacrifice. Like 7? Man, like, what if we do 1,000? So it's just like spiritual thanks, like, to an incredible degree. And this is what Solomon's reign is sort of like. But this is a really good thing. God is happy with this. So let's look in chapter 3. This is probably a famous scene that you might be familiar with if you know about Solomon. So there in Gibeon, verse 5, in Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. And God said, "Ask what I shall give thee." And Solomon said, "Thou hast showed unto thy servant David, my father, great mercy, according as he walked before thee in truth and in righteousness and in uprightness of heart with thee. And thou hast kept for him this great kindness, that thou hast given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. And now, O Lord my God, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David my father, and I am but a little child. I know not how to go in or to come out." I said that backwards, but how to go out or come in. "And thy servant is in the midst of thy people which thou hast chosen, a great people that cannot be numbered or counted for multitude. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this, thy so great a people?" And the speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. God said unto him, "Because thou hast asked this, and hast not asked thyself long life, neither hast thou asked riches for thyself, nor hast asked the life of thine enemies, but hast asked for thyself understanding to discern judgment, behold, I have done according to thy words. Lo, I have given thee a wise and an understanding heart, so that there was none like thee before thee, neither after thee shall any arise like unto thee. I have also given thee that which thou hast not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee all thy days. And if thou wilt walk in my ways, keep my statutes and my commandments as thy father David did walk, then I will lengthen thy days." And Solomon awoke, behold, it was a dream. And he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered up burnt offerings and offered peace offerings and made a feast to all his servants. So if you're familiar with the story of Solomon, this might be what you know. This dream vision where God just kind of writes him a blank check and sees what he does with it. And that's the important thing. This is his decision point. And the same language is used. We talked before about good and bad, good and evil. Like we talked about that evil spirit Saul had, the Ra was the word, which just means like destructive or bad. It's the same thing here when he says, I don't know how to discern between, here it's good and bad. He's being offered like it's the tree situation, okay? This is his temptation in the garden, if you will. It's like, okay, he needs to learn, he's a king. He needs to know how to discern between good and evil. How are you going to get it? That's the question. Instead of just doing what he thinks is best, he's going to ask God. Like God wants him to be able to discern between good and bad, good and evil, to be a just judge and king. How are you going to go about that? Seems to be the question. And Solomon asks for wisdom and is just given everything in return. He's going to be the most wise. He's going to be given riches and honor. And that's going to play out throughout Solomon's life. Question 6. What did Solomon recognize about his father's relationship to God? You might need to look back at some of the early stuff there. What's that?
A strong relationship?
Yes, very strong relationship. Yeah, I thought that was interesting because we talked so much about that. That even came up in Sunday school last week, that mercy is how David sees God primarily. But yeah, so he realized that David lived before God in truth, in the right way. They had a strong relationship. God was merciful to him. And it says, question 7, what attitude did Solomon display in his self-evaluation? And the one-word answer in the book is humility. Excellent choice. Excellent choice. Considering what Solomon requested, how seriously do you think he took his position as king and judge? Yeah, some of these are like little throwaway questions, but yeah, it's interesting that, I mean, it's the point of Solomon's story, is that he chooses wisdom from God to rule God's people because he actually values the position he's in. He understands it's like this is a blessed thing that he is part of. He's ruling God's people, and he wants to sincerely do it well. And that can't be said for everyone we've seen throughout, well, even this, the first king. But we'll move on. In your book on page 104, another story you may have heard about Solomon, well, we're going to read it in the book because it's more concise. Page 104, Solomon demonstrated his wisdom in deciding civil matters as well as in other ways. In one civil case, two prostitutes who lived together and had babies 3 days apart asked him to decide an extremely difficult matter. One of the babies had died during the night, and its mother exchanged it for the living baby. In the morning, the other mother discovered that the dead baby was not hers, but the guilty mother refused to admit what she had done. Both claimed the living baby, so Solomon ordered that the child be cut in half and each mother given half. When one of the women agreed to Solomon's plan, Solomon knew that she wasn't the mother and gave the child to the other woman. Soon Solomon's wisdom was the topic of conversation throughout Israel. One little odd, dark story that gets put in there just as an example of Solomon's wisdom, and then this, not just this story, but Solomon's general dealing in all sorts of matters just becomes incredibly famous throughout Israel and beyond. And the wisdom that God promised him is known far and wide. Yeah.
And again, back then, when he said, I'll cut it in half,
Yeah.
those women realized he wasn't.
He's not messing around, yeah.
Not messing around. He did that kind of stuff back then. It's just,
Yeah.
If they would go to the freedom, agree to it, they both want to agree to it, we had done it.
I don't know, but back then, kings or whatever, they
Yeah.
had that kind of authority, so.
It was smart, the way Kurt put it. Okay, you're not,
Yeah.
she has love for me,
Yeah. Yeah. So we think this is like this.
Yeah.
Go for such a thing as
Right.
this type of thing, yeah. But back then it worked because the mindset was, it was believable.
Mm-hmm.
Legitimate thing, yeah.
first thing I saw, she was proud of us, smart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's detective, this is like a detective now.
Yeah.
They
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and it's interesting because you think like, okay, why this case, this trial? And you got to think it kind of shows some legal ideas there, like, oh, he's smart, he knows things, he's 2 steps ahead, but like he knows people. Like, so the wisdom is the real mother will not allow this child to die. The real mother will even give up the child so that it can live rather than see this happen to it. So there's a definite, like, he's not just smart, like, he's actually wise. There's a understanding of the heart of people, and, they could have picked anything from his reign, and this odd little story gets put in there, so it's probably worth giving some thought to. But we see more about, we're definitely going to finish this, nice. We see more about Solomon. Chapter 4. We're going to jump ahead to verse 20. Okay. Judah and Israel were many, as the sand which is by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and making merry. And Solomon reigned over all kingdoms from the river unto the land of the Philistines and unto the border of Egypt. They brought presents and served Solomon all the days of his life. And Solomon's provision for one day was 30 measures of fine flour, 80 measures of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 and 20 oxen out of the pastures, and 100 sheep, besides harts, roebucks, fallow deer, and fatted fowl. For he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river, from Tipsah to Azza, over all the kings on this side of the river, and he had peace on all sides round about him. And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine and under his fig, from Dan to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. Did anything jump out at you in this description? There's some odd stuff in there, but we'll talk about it. Anything jump out at you? Yeah. Living the good life. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the thing. The measurements might seem like a weird, like, you were telling a perfectly good, painting a nice picture, and then you got into weird, like, amounts of wheat and stuff. But it's showing, like, it took so much to support the king's establishment, which is kind of speaking to the size of his government. And he's just, like, he's ruling everything. His government, his kingdom is so big, it needs all this stuff to support it. So it's actually, like, kind of lending to the magnificence of it, if you will. So, yeah, that's what that measurement stuff is about. But did anything else jump out at you? There's peace, yes, there's peace with the other countries. Check out verse 20, where we started. Judah and Israel were many, as the sand which is by the sea in multitude. So you might think, okay, a lot of people. If you remember, we've talked about throughout these last two series the promises that God made to Abraham way back in the book of Genesis. God is using Abraham and his family to bring a blessing to all the nations. Abraham's family is the one that the Messiah will come through, the one who will crush the head of the serpent, who kind of brings them back to Eden. That's the idea that's being played out. And he says, through you, Abraham, you're going to be the father of many nations who are like the stars and like the sand by the seashore, like for multitude. Look at the stars if you can count them, God says. That's how many your descendants will be. The sand at the shore, that's how many your descendants will be. So we're getting this picture of the kingdom under Solomon, and he says, well, you know how many people there are? Like the sand on the seashore. And if you noticed, some of the land may not have meant much to you, like the land markers. So it's going from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines. It says from Dan to Beersheba, that's north to south. This is the biggest the kingdom has been. This is, they were supposed to inherit. It's huge. When they were, doing the conquest under Joshua before we got to the Judges, they're supposed to be taking this huge land that God's promised them. And you remember from Judges, they take fractions of it because they don't follow God. They start, trusting like pagan idols and deities, and they're not doing quite what they should. David expands through conquest a little bit, but then under Solomon, you got like his borders just expanded. So Israel is like the sand by the seashore. He inherits the land that they were supposed to inherit. There's peace on all sides. And you have, in verse 25, Judah and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine and under his fig tree. So it's painting this picture where, like, everyone, they have their own vines and fig trees. So vines, grapes, wine is always a sign of God's abundant blessing in the Old Testament. And then the fig tree is like, that's the prime fruit tree that you have in the ancient Near East. So there's utter abundance under King Solomon for everyone. It's painting this almost a little too marvelous picture of life under Solomon, and I think it's getting you to, you should be starting to ask questions of, hey, there's someone from the line of Abraham. When the promise to Abraham is fulfilled, Israel will be like so many people, by like the sand by the seashore. They will, the promise to Abraham is to inherit this land and to have God actually like provide in this Eden-like way. And you see, man, there's enough food for everyone. Everyone has, the vines. Everyone has the fig tree. And you're kind of going, this is the man of peace. This is a man who God loves. Is this like, they're setting you up as a Messiah figure. Is this the climax to the story? And they kind of leave you at this like ultimate, like this is the best we've seen. David started to look that way as we talked about that priestly king. He's sort of bringing some of the original thing that man was supposed to be, and is living this out as the king in Salem. He's the Prince of Peace. But Solomon, man, he's just crushing it. We know he's going to make the temple later. That's already been prophesied. And you're going, wow, this is something. This could be the climax of the promise made to Abraham. And then next week's going to happen. So like, it's like when we had that great week with King David, when he's crushing it. He's crushing his enemies. He's being kind to people. He's bringing the ark to Jerusalem. And then, we had situations with Bathsheba and all the fallout after that. So kind of like Solomon, we're having the sand by the seashore. We're having all the land. We're having peace with everyone. There's plenty. It's like a perfect, ideal situation. And then we'll see what happens. We might actually get out a little early. Let's just finish up with chapter 4, verse 29. And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding exceeding much, and largeness of heart, even as the sand that is on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country and the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman the Chalcol, and Darda the sons of Mael, and his fame was in all nations round about. He spake 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. And he spoke of trees, from the cedar tree that is in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spake also of beasts and fowl and creeping things and of fishes. And there came of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon, from all the kings of the earth, which had heard of his wisdom. Yep, that's right. So not only do you have everything we just said, now you have the kings of the earth flooding into Jerusalem to sit at the feet of Solomon and basically hear the wisdom of God. And the prophets come later, but this is because the Bible's meant to be read and reread, and everything kind of influences and speaks to everything else. The idea of not only is Israel at peace, but the kings of the nations come, and they are kind of subservient, and they want to hear the God of Israel. They want to hear the wisdom of God. And you're sort of getting this further picture painted. So this is all going to go terribly wrong, spoiler alert. But one, it's doing what it's doing to set up a picture of what the image of God could and should be. But this is also just about Solomon, and this was his life. And next week we'll dig into a specific ruler who comes to sit at his feet. We get mentions of some apparently very wise people. In verse 31, there's a handful of people named who Solomon is wiser than. I looked at commentaries. Some people think that they're referring to certain people in Israel that are known, and then we have no idea who they are. But apparently, back when this was written, that was a big deal, that he was wiser than these people, wiser than the wisdom of the East, than Egypt. Egypt is known for its wisdom, its spiritual stuff. There's a lot going on in Egypt.
And then the East is where the wise men came from, that type of thing. So
Yeah.
over that way,
Mm-hmm.
that's a pretty sharp guy. Everybody wasn't a savage back then.
No. Yep. Yeah, so this was the beginning of Solomon's reign. we saw him put down the attempt at his one half-brother to take the throne, even though God had promised it to Solomon. So we saw that. We saw some of his lawful executions and him following God, basically. So the sacrifices at Gibeon, God being very pleased with Solomon, giving Solomon the wisdom that he asked for, and it is just all over that Solomon's choice of choosing God's wisdom is what results in this like near perfection, we can call it, this incredible state where everyone is, the promises of God look like they're panning out. And that's the big thing the good that we take from the life of Solomon. Next week we'll get into the second half of his reign, and then there's 1 week after that. So there's only 2 weeks left. This was lesson 11. We'll have 12. And then the last week is, like I said, when we're going to connect the big things in the kings that connect to the image of Jesus later down the road, the shadows of Shiloh, like the book is called. So I think if you take one thing from Solomon, it's like, where do you get your wisdom from? Because he knew he didn't have it. How do I rule these people? Well, it's got to be from God. If I'm going to discern good from evil, I'm not doing that myself. It has to be God's wisdom, and that's the only thing that brings about the blessing and promise. So that's the lesson. Any questions, comments, concerns? It would be. There have been a few attempts. Yeah, you know what? There was a series, I don't think it lasted the season, on ABC a few years back where they were taking basically the story of David. So it was like ABC. It was really well done. I saw the first few episodes where you're dealing with some of the war, of course, but then the political drama of David as this young up-and-comer with Saul reigning as king, Samuel as this odd, guy who used to be in charge, who sort of Saul sees as a political rival, and it had a lot of potential. It was back, when History Channel did that Bible series, you remember, years back? That was popular, and ABC actually tried to get in on it, but it didn't succeed for whatever reason. I've long thought all this would make excellent material for movies, if not maybe a little too violent for some younger people, but not these days. Not these days. Okay, so if we have nothing else, I think that's good. The series was called something like Prophets and Kings or something like that. So, yeah. But okay, so we'll be good. Next week we'll finish up Solomon, and we'll have a very interesting, hopefully, look at both testaments and how the kings point to Jesus. So that's good. We'll end there. Let's pray. Holy Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the wisdom that we can see in your word as you call us to choose your wisdom. So I just thank you for what is still here and preserved for us and can draw us closer to you. So I thank you for that, and just pray that you would allow what you want to be on our hearts and minds as we go forward. Pray you'd bring us back safely next week. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. All right, thank you.